Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story filled with intense drama, danger, and tough choices. What happens when the past comes crashing into the present, threatening everything you've worked for? Can love and determination protect the ones you hold dear, or will the shadows of the past tear them apart? Stay tuned to find out, and if you enjoy this journey, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. After the chaotic confrontation with the gangsters, Tieu Lac and the CEO finally arrived back at their apartment in the city. The relief of being safe felt bittersweet. Though the immediate danger had passed, Tieu Lac's mind was clouded with worry. The weight of what had happened back in her hometown hung heavy in her chest. She stood by the window, looking out at the city below, but her thoughts were far away. The city lights seemed distant now, her heart still tethered to the small village where her mother remained. The CEO, noticing her unease, walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Tieu Lac, what's on your mind?" he asked softly. "You've been quiet." She turned to face him, her eyes full of concern. "I keep thinking about my mom," she said, her voice shaky. "What if the gangsters come after her? What if they hurt her to get to me?" The CEO's heart sank as he saw the fear in her eyes. He had already promised to protect her, but this was different. Her mother wasn't here. She was alone in the village, and the gangsters could target her as a way to hurt Tieu Lac. "She's strong," the CEO said, trying to reassure her, "and we'll make sure she's safe. I'll figure out a way to protect her." But even as he said the words, he knew that he couldn't guarantee her safety. He had done what he could to protect Tieu Lac, but now the threat was shifting. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about her family. The next few hours passed in a blur. Tieu Lac couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The more she thought about her mother alone in the village, the more anxious she became. The CEO, noticing her restlessness, picked up his phone and made a call. "I'll reach out to some people I know," he said, his voice firm. "We'll make sure your mom is safe. We'll send someone to check on her." Tieu Lac looked at him, feeling a little better, but the anxiety in her chest didn't subside. What if they come after her again? What if she's caught in the middle of all this? The CEO shook his head. "We won't let that happen. I'll make sure the people I send will stay close to her. She won't be alone." The next morning, the CEO made a few calls to his contacts in the city. He didn't want to alarm Tieu Lac, but he needed to take action. The gangsters weren't just a threat to Tieu Lac and their baby anymore. They were a threat to her entire family. He couldn't let them get away with this. Tieu Lac watched him as he worked, her worry growing with each minute. It wasn't just the gangsters she was worried about, it was the helplessness she felt. She couldn't protect her mother from this distance, and the thought of her mom being in danger again was too much to bear. The CEO hung up the phone and turned to her. "I've arranged for some people to stay with your mom. They'll keep an eye on her and make sure she's safe. We'll get a team to go to your village and make sure everything's secure." She nodded slowly, feeling a small wave of relief wash over her. At least her mom wasn't completely alone, but the worry still gnawed at her. "I'll go to the village myself," the CEO continued, his voice steady. "I'll make sure your mother is okay. You've done enough. Now it's my turn to protect your family." Later that day, the CEO prepared to leave for the village. He had arranged everything carefully, but Tieu Lac couldn't help but feel anxious. She knew he was doing this for her, but it didn't make the fear any less real. "Be careful," she said softly as she hugged him before he left. "Please don't take unnecessary risks. I can't lose you too." The CEO held her tightly, his hands gently cupping her face. "I won't take any risks. I'll make sure your mom is safe, and I'll be back before you know it. You're not alone, Tieu Lac. We're in this together." Her heart swelled with love for him, but the fear in her chest didn't subside. He kissed her forehead before stepping away, ready to head out. "I'll be back soon," he said before leaving the apartment. As the door closed behind him, Tieu Lac stood by the window, watching him disappear into the distance. She wasn't sure if it was the right decision for him to go, but she knew it was one he had to make. The drive to the village was quiet, the CEO's thoughts occupied with the situation at hand. He had taken all the precautions he could, but he knew the risks were still high. The gangsters were not people to be underestimated, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. When he arrived at the outskirts of the village, he immediately contacted his team, who had already arrived and was stationed around Tieu Lac's family home. The area was quiet, but that didn't mean they were safe. The CEO ordered his team to stay alert and to report any suspicious activity immediately. Back at the village, Tieu Lac's mother was sitting in her small home, unaware of the trouble brewing just outside. She had received a call from the CEO earlier, and she knew he was sending someone to protect her. But still, the unease lingered. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation, the fear of what might happen if the gangsters came for her again. She had been strong throughout the years, handling everything on her own. But now, in her quiet home, she realized just how much her daughter's choices had affected her. She had never wanted Tieu Lac to face danger, to get caught up in this web of chaos, but now she understood. Tieu Lac had left to protect her future, to build a life with the CEO, and yet here they were, fighting to protect their families. The CEO arrived at Tieu Lac's family home to find his team already in position. The area was still calm, but he knew better than to assume it would stay that way. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The faintest sounds of movement in the distance caught his attention. "Stay sharp," he ordered his team quietly. "We're not leaving here until we know everything is clear." His instincts were on high alert, and he could feel the weight of the situation. He couldn't let anything happen to Tieu Lac's mother, not after everything they had gone through. As he approached the house, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Tieu Lac. She had texted, asking how things were going. He quickly replied, "We're keeping her safe. I'll be back soon. Don't worry." But the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that things were far from over. The gangsters wouldn't stop. Not until they got what they wanted. And as the CEO prepared for the confrontation ahead, he knew that this battle was only just beginning. As the CEO stood outside Tieu Lac's family home, his senses were on high alert. The area was eerily quiet, the stillness in the air almost palpable. His team was strategically positioned, but the CEO knew that even the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. The gangsters weren't the kind of people to back down, and he had a feeling they would return for more trouble. The CEO scanned the surroundings once more, trying to pick up on any signs of movement. The shadows seemed to stretch longer as the sun began to set, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. He quickly answered, his voice low but firm. "What's the situation?" "We've got movement, sir," one of his men reported. "A few figures heading in the direction of the house. They're moving cautiously, but they're definitely not here for a visit." The CEO's jaw tightened. "Prepare for a confrontation. Do not engage unless necessary. We need to handle this carefully." He glanced at his team, giving them a subtle nod of approval. They were prepared, but so were the gangsters. There was no room for error. The stakes were too high. Back at the apartment, Tieu Lac sat by the window, her thoughts still racing. She hadn't heard from the CEO in a while, and the silence was only increasing her anxiety. She knew he was doing everything he could to protect her family, but the fear for her mother never truly left. Every minute felt like an eternity. She looked down at the baby in her arms, feeling the weight of her responsibility. She wasn't just protecting her life now, she was protecting her child's future. And if anything were to happen to her, to them, she couldn't bear the thought of it. She took a deep breath and tried to push away the feeling of dread. She trusted the CEO. He would protect them. He had to. Just as she turned away from the window to sit down, her phone buzzed. It was a message from him. "I'm on my way back. Everything's fine. Stay calm." She let out a sigh of relief, but the worry still lingered. Her instincts told her that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. Meanwhile, the CEO's team had already engaged. The gangsters were closing in, and the CEO's heart raced as he weighed his options. They couldn't allow the situation to escalate any further. The last thing he wanted was for things to get out of hand and risk the safety of Tieu Lac and her family. His phone buzzed again, a text from Tieu Lac this time. "Please be careful. I can't lose you." His heart clenched as he read the words. He couldn't afford to let her down. He couldn't afford to fail her. "Stay close," the CEO instructed his team, his voice now more urgent. "We need to neutralize the threat before it reaches the house." As they moved into position, the CEO's mind raced. His priorities had shifted the moment Tieu Lac had entered his life. He was no longer just fighting for himself, but for her, for their family. And nothing, not even the gangsters who thought they could intimidate him, would stand in his way. The tension was thick in the air as they moved closer to the gangsters. The CEO's senses were heightened, his every movement deliberate and calculated. They had to act quickly. Suddenly, the figures of the gangsters appeared in the distance, emerging from the shadows like predators closing in on their prey. The CEO's team was already positioned, ready to make their move. The CEO took a deep breath and gave a subtle nod to his men. It was time to confront them. "Hold your fire," the CEO commanded. "Let's make this clean. We don't want to draw attention." They moved swiftly, positioning themselves around the gangsters. The CEO's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. He couldn't let them intimidate him. They had to be stopped before they could do any more harm. "Enough games," the CEO called out, his voice loud and commanding. The gangsters froze, turning slowly to face him. One of them stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man. What makes you think you can take us on?" The CEO's gaze was cold, his voice unwavering. "I'm not just one man. I'm someone you don't want to mess with." He stepped forward, his team closing in around him, forming a circle of protection. The gangsters seemed to hesitate for a moment, realizing they were outnumbered. But that didn't stop them from reaching for their weapons. The CEO signaled his men to prepare. "Drop the weapons," the CEO demanded. "Now." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the sound of rustling in the bushes nearby. The gangsters weren't backing down, but neither was the CEO. He wasn't about to let them threaten his family again. Just as the situation was about to escalate, one of the gangsters lunged forward, swinging a bat at the CEO. The CEO ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and countered with a swift punch to the man's gut. The gangster staggered back, his breath knocked out of him, but he wasn't down for long. The fight broke out quickly, the CEO and his team using their superior training to overpower the gangsters. But the CEO was focused on one thing: keeping Tieu Lac's family safe. As the gangsters were subdued, the CEO stayed alert, ensuring that no one else would get hurt. Finally, after a tense few moments, the gangsters were forced to surrender. They dropped their weapons, their faces bruised and bloodied from the confrontation. The CEO stood tall, breathing heavily but steady. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his gaze turning toward the team who had successfully neutralized the threat. "It's over," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "They're not going to bother us again." He quickly called Tieu Lac to update her on the situation. "It's done," he said when she picked up. "You're safe. Your mum's safe." The relief in Tieu Lac's voice was palpable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The CEO smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "You don't have to worry anymore. We're in this together." As the CEO made his way back to the car, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it through the night, but the reality of the situation wasn't lost on him. This battle might be over, but the war wasn't won yet. They were safe, for now. But what would happen next? Would the gangsters return, and would their newfound peace last, or would it be shattered once again? Only time would tell. In this episode, the CEO and Tieu Lac return home after a dangerous confrontation with gangsters. As they head back to the city, Tieu Lac is overwhelmed with concern for her mother, still in the village and vulnerable to the threats lingering. With the gangsters still at large, the CEO decides to take matters into his own hands and protect Tieu Lac's family. As tensions rise, the CEO confronts the gangsters head-on, risking everything to safeguard the woman he loves and their baby. Will the CEO's determination be enough to protect them, or will the shadows of their past return to haunt them? Stay tuned as their struggle for safety intensifies.